Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Welcome into this edition of On the Ledge. I'm Dave Trafford, along with John Wright, and Keith Leslie is here, and we're happy to include and welcome back Sabrina Nanji from the Queen's Park Observer. Big week at the park, and I think probably a big week in sort of this political history of this province. And I do want to get to the fall economic statement, but I think we should really start with the tribute to and the memorial service for Premier Davis. And John Wright, I know you spent time working at the park in the days that Davis was premier. My father-in-law worked in Premier Davis's office for a while. Keith, you would have covered some of the time that Mr. Davis was the head of government. And I think, Sabrina, even today, we begin to see it really kind of punctuates and highlights the state of our politics right now when you begin to hear how people remembered Premier Davis and what he brought to public service. I think with what we're looking at now in terms of the ingrained siloed politics, we could probably take a lesson from that era of politics in Ontario.
I had a remarkable opportunity as a parliamentary intern in 1980-81 at the park to work for all kinds of different people. In fact, you will recall 1981, Keith, I think you would have covered it, would have been the election campaign. And it was very contentious because it was about the Constitution. And so you would end up in these rooms where Bill Davis would have to handle people who were rather upset that certain things that Mr. Trudeau was doing. It was also a great scandal at the time. It was a trust company called Astor Trust Raymore, which had gone down and there hadn't been much oversight. And being in a minority situation, the Administration of Justice Committee really hammered away at the government. So I had firsthand where I worked for John Macbeth, who was a former labor minister. He was leaving politics. He was in his late 60s, I would suspect. And so he didn't really have me do any work there. What I did was retire almost every day to his office where a large bottle of a dark rum was pulled out from beside him, and we sat and just talked about things. In fact, the only thing I can attest to being there, Dave, is that I wrote the resolution which renovated the Parliament buildings. That was it. That was my sole contribution. I went and worked on an election campaign. I came back. I was assigned, which was Don Cousins. And that was so I could learn. And then I came back and worked for Sheila Copps for about a month before I finished. So what it did do, and that's where I just wanted to get to all of that, was all of these people knew each other. And I, to be in those days, I think what prompted the intimacy, even Sheila Copps and how she railed at Bill Davis when she first went in about the death of her father and blah, 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 was there was a night session and it took on a magic to its own. And people walked across the aisles and they sat down beside each other and they made each other friends. They were foes, but they were friends. And when Mike Harris took that away, I think it changed the whole dynamic of the House because that was Davis's imprint. That was who he was. You could be a foe and he was able to disarm you. He believed very much in the behind the scenes connectivity with people. So we heard a lot of that yesterday. Not just about him, but how the place operated. And I think that's the thing, for this podcast that I bring to the table, and I'm sure others would in a moment, the atmosphere of the House and the way in which doing things were emblematic of the man himself, not just what he did. It was imparted through how they did things. And it's gone. It's not there anymore. And I hope that some of that was imparted back to all the leaders who were there.
He also used it as smart politics, though, when he wanted to extend the Roman Catholic school funding to, the grades 11 and 12. He got the NDP and the Liberals to agree to this before he announced it. There was some major opposition all across Ontario to this idea, and yet politically, by being cooperative, by working with these guys, just like he did on many issues, he was able to get that through. And, they all took political heat for it. It wasn't a unanimous decision that everyone wanted to see in Ontario, but all three parties took the same amount of heat for it in the 85 election. It proved ultimately to be the downfall. They lost, they didn't get him. Davis barely hung on, or it was Frank Miller, rather, in 85, barely hung on, and they were defeated in the House a month later. But it was Davis, after he left that job as premier, he still advised every premier of every stripe. As Bob Rae said, Bob Rae was as surprised as everyone when he became premier in 1990. He said one of the first phone calls was Bill Davis, Robert, and offering him advice, and the same with David Peters. We just heard this from everyone, that he advised them all, and he said, just don't quote me publicly. It's because that's the way politics is supposed to work. And it's the kind of thing we just don't see anymore. And I think John's point about the night sittings, I covered a lot of those night sittings in the 80s. They were fun times. They could be incredibly boring, but they could also be fun times. And they were when you saw people at their real selves, because many times the different party members would go out to dinner before the night sitting. And then the night sittings would be a little bit more lubricated.
Well, they would
yes.
arrive with some guidance.
And so things were fun. But as well, Davis and his partner, political partner, Roy McMurtry, I mean, the things they did for Canada, for Ontario, and they were consistent throughout. They were true progressive conservatives, and what they managed to accomplish as a team. And Davis and McMurtry both, they just still, right to the very end of their careers, endured nothing but respect from almost all sides.
The only thing I'd add we could do a whole podcast on this, and it wouldn't necessarily be just about reminiscing. It would be to bring some of those lessons back, because we'd seen them at close range. I mean, especially you, Keith, who covered them every single day. But much to your point, there was a sense when you saw, the Constitution, like some of the big battles that were going on, and you see somebody like Roy McMurtry, who went on to be probably one of the most lauded jurists that we have in the country. They played together on the varsity football team, and they showed that yesterday. There were relationships that went very deep, and you forget sometimes that Margaret Birch was the first female appointed to cabinet. That Bill Davis did that. He appointed Betty Stevenson to do education when she was a doctor, but and then had her, Frank Miller put her in as the first treasurer. There were a lot of firsts even back then. And we just have to remind people that it's not just recent history that give us those lessons, but the anecdotes are so, I mean, you could go on for hours about this, but it certainly brings it forward to today.
Well, and like I said off the top, my father-in-law worked in Davis's office for a while, and he worked closely with Roy McMurtry when he was the AG. So what you saw there in motion, I think, and we still see the effects of it today. I mean, this is the days when we were repatriating our Constitution. The whole idea of the kitchen cabinet that kind of came together, and McMurtry was part of that, and clearly Premier Davis was part of that history that moved the needle on, bringing the Constitution home. So, we kind of closed the book on that as we memorialize Bill Davis. But, and again, I come back to you, Sabrina, you're in the House every day paying attention to what's going on now in the legislature. And you begin to wonder, sort of the state of affairs based, up against the way John and Keith have painted it historically. The idea that, you have to have the most votes in the House to get anything done now. The idea that we would have sort of that cross-aisle discussion in any kind of meaningful way, it seems kind of silly even to suggest that would happen.
Yeah, it doesn't quite happen like that so much these days anymore. And yeah, I mean, Bill Davis was a bit before my time, but he's obviously still a legend at Queen's Park. I mean, he's shaped Ontario the way we know it today, like our college system, for instance. And yeah, I think it's already been mentioned that every politician of political stripe has been inspired by him in some way. And I think that the thing that is maybe a lesson that I think all politicians could take away is that his style, people say, is kind of that boring was good, right? Like that was kind of his style of governing, and just sort of getting things done and in a more collaborative way. I think that's something that's missing these days. So, yeah, I don't know. Maybe the parties that were there and memorialized him. Maybe next week will be a little more chill in question period. I don't know. I don't know. I guess we'll have to see about that one.
Well, to some degree, I mean, in terms of leadership currently, I think we probably see that in John Tory, who obviously included Premier Davis among his mentors. And you saw that, in terms of how he spoke yesterday, John, when the mayor got up. He had a difficult time talking about it, and he compared the effect that Davis had on him as to the effect his own father had on him.
Yeah, and his godfather, Ted Rogers. I mean, he didn't mention that, but they were all legends, all of them. And you saw people yesterday who, like even Sally Barnes, who was just great, had covered Davis as a reporter and then went into the press office there for him. I mean, these people told anecdotes that were very, very personal, and they tried to hold it together. And I'm not sure you'd see that with too many politicians nowadays. They were able to make fun of some of the greatest leaders sitting in the audience through him, and also those people who got to the stage, including the prime minister, who made us all laugh talking about when Davis and his father were sitting together, and Davis taught him about football and what it all meant. But then at the end of the day, would have said to Trudeau Senior, your son's very tall and he's a nice kid, but he's a little misguided. Like just the way in which it was said, and everyone would roar because. And then talking about the circumlocution, those of us who had the great fortune to attend either the House or go on and see, and I did go to a number of those luncheons where Hugh Siegel had written a 32 page Orator Ball check against delivery speech, which was never used, not a single time. And he would just make fun of people in the audience and do teasing things. But at the end of that 20 minutes of him speaking, he would turn and he would say, but let me talk to you about this for a moment. And he would end with a 2-minute crescendo on something serious and leave the stage. And that was the thing that got the headline. So it was the mastery of connecting again with aides who would have laughed all the time at that, who would have been with him because he cared about them deeply. There was just something magic about that whole personality and the era. And man, if you ever have a chance to see some of the films of Bill Davis in his life, it's worthwhile taking a look at them. I will say this to everybody who's listening in: The Candidate with Robert Redford is absolutely you gotta watch it. If you've never seen it, pull it up and watch it because it has so many political lessons, not only for today, but it exemplified the era. I mean, the ad guy in that is Norman Atkin of the Big Blue Machine. You can see. So pull it up and watch it. It's worth it if you're a political junkie.
All right. So the Davis memorial was so significant. Of course, the premier had to be there, Doug Ford, but was not in the legislature for the fall economic statement. And Sabrina, I heard you talking on the radio before you went into the lockdown, and you kind of had your list of goodies that you expected to see in there. Was there something that jumped out at you that you didn't expect in the economic statement?
I guess there were a couple of things missing that I was expecting, I should say. There were no tax cuts in there, and there's a lot of promises that the PCs made in 2018, like a tax break for middle income earners, even cutting the cost of gas by 10 cents a liter, which actually is something Premier Doug Ford brought up just a couple of days ago. So, I mean, that was nowhere to be seen in this document. And so now I think the government's probably saving some of those things closer to the spring or maybe even the spring budget, which is going to be released just before the writ drops. And obviously, that's a really nice, shiny election goodie that they can share with voters just before they go to the polls. So I think, yeah, it was maybe a bit meatier than I thought it was going to be. Lately, our fall economic statements have just been, I mean, definitely in pandemic times, like an update on the finances, like here's where we are. our deficit's looking a little better, that type of thing. But I think, yeah, it definitely is a big pivot for the PCs, of course, and is setting the stage for 2022. I think obviously there was a lot of those worker friendly policies, and big highway spending, big infrastructure spending. They've obviously been pumping themselves up as the party of yes. So I think just generally we're starting to see the campaign take shape, but the Ford government still has a lot to do to fulfill their mandate and not a whole lot of time left before June.
Well, I do want to get into the highway story in a minute, but one of the things that, again, you back to the idea that you suggested that this was, sort of a worker-friendly policy that they laid out and goodies. I begin to wonder whether or not the whole daycare discussion is going to follow the path you suggested vis-a-vis, let's wait until the spring when it becomes more, I guess, more of an impact closer to the campaign. I can't see how they're going to be able to get out from underneath at least having some kind of plan and policy that coincides with what the other provinces and the feds are putting on the table.
They're going to have to. They're going to have to strike a deal with the Liberals, whether they like it or not. And I think you're absolutely right. It's going to be positioned closer to the election where it'll have a bigger impact. I think the same way, as Sabrina alluded to, there was a lot of meat in the fall economic statement, but they, of course, used their communication strategy to leak the media stuff, especially the $15 minimum wage, which was in the statement, but of course done a couple days before. And the reason it was done separately, of course, was so that you could get two big union leaders standing there with Premier Ford praising the government's action on this. You weren't going to get that on a fall economic statement day. So they took that out of made it a separate entity, which was smart for them. They got a lot of ink coverage for it. I think it was pretty significant. I also think, the opposition parties can cry all they want about being, late and having delayed this. The impact is it's here now, and that's what's going to count. The change to the server minimum wage, wiping that out, huge. I think that's huge, especially for people going back to work now. Remains to be seen what the impact of that is going to be on these small businesses. The Premier clearly said, we've given them enough here. We're looking out for the workers here. So that was a different kind of strategy. So it all turned around then that it made so all the healthcare, the long-term care beds, the hospital funding, all that had all been previously announced. So what we were left to focus on, Dave, was you talked about was the infrastructure, specifically Highway 413 and the Bradford bypass, which is going to connect the top of the 404 to Highway 400. Two pretty controversial highways, as we know, especially because the environmental assessment for the 413, I believe, is like 25 years old. And I don't know that one has been done yet for the Bradford bypass, but apparently we learned that the routing has been altered to avoid a golf course owned by the father of the associate transport minister. So all of this, but we ended up, they had the staycation tax credit in the fall economic statement as well. Nice little bit, although you have to spend a lot of money to get the maximum out of that. And it all has to be spent at a hotel or a motel, from what I can see, to qualify for it.
I wonder whether or not that actually is on point. The whole idea of, you have to be spending it on, particularly it sounded more like a hotel or motels or campsites, that kind of thing. And I was suggesting, earlier, John, that maybe, as we were listening to things unfold this past summer and all of the great events that make this province, such a great place to be in the summer, like the festivals. And I think particularly I'm close to, my heart is close to the folks at Mariposa. I've got the poster on my studio wall from the very first festival, and this would have been this past summer their 60th festival, and they missed it. And they're not the only ones. But I know Lisa McLeod at one point had said, okay, we got money out there that we're going to actually support some of these arts organizations, and Mariposa was among them. It occurs to me that if you really wanted that to catch fire, that if I had bought tickets for their July, and they just went on sale for their July festival this year, that should be part of that staycation credit, because I might not have otherwise traveled to Aurelia to go to the festival. But I know now I can do two things. I can support Aurelia's economy, I can support the festival, and I'm going to get a credit because I'm doing my staycation, which I may not have otherwise done.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you on this. And I kind of focus through the political lens on a lot of this stuff, because here we are actually talking about this and not other things that we're missing from the budget, such as, affordable housing and a bunch of other things that people had talked about. So I take your point. I don't know whether or not it's simply a matter of whether people get to keep receipts from a ticket stub or something that you can put on your taxes for credit or whatever. I don't know. but at least this had some political impact on the discourse that we're dealing with today. The second thing is I kind of look at this as a runway full of all kinds of lights. We have the throne speech that was thin. We have it connected to an update economic statement, which has a little more meat to it. We then have a budget in the spring. We have then a campaign platform to which all of those things build the momentum and the pieces together. And then we have the campaign itself. So there's a lot of runway to fit different things in. The second thing is the government has, and the political calculus on this seems to have gutted, the union support for Andrea Horwath. I mean, it's just not going to be there. They've calibrated this very carefully. Although unions are those strange beasts, of course, that no matter what leader they have, even one of their own, they likely could eat for lunch any day. But nonetheless, they've managed to take that and put that there. They've run the advertisements. I think they've probably done, of course, the polling that Nick Kouvalis would do to find that Del Duca is just not on their radar screen to worry about, probably both from a personality and otherwise. And plus, if he complains about a highway, there's some things that he did in his own backyard that they're going to bring up. But I'm curious about the highway, again, not so much on the cost that might be revealed 6 months from now. Notice that was just said there. I don't know whether or not they want to, but that 905 is really important to them. And the calculus is going to have to be whether that 905 highway through there is actually seen as something that's beneficial to the regions, which means that you're going to get the local councils involved, because some of them have said we don't necessarily want this. So there's others who might say, look, it's a lot of employment. I mean, you can build on it, but it's interesting that they're pushing that, yes, we build highways phrase right through the very area that they really need to win. But I think they're looking at it, just like I've said, they've got this big, remember we used to play Risk. I think they're just looking at it that way, moving pieces around to kind of take out some territory. So I think that 905 and the highway may be a real turning point if they're not careful on this.
I just want to pick up on one thing John said. Are we sure they're going to have a platform? I don't believe they had one in 2018.
They didn't.
And they didn't even cost it, even when they said they would.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting, as I was listening to what was going on yesterday, and the minister's standing in the House and he's delivering his statement, Sabrina, it occurred to me that there are a lot of shiny things here. And to John's point, I kept waiting to see, okay, I want to see what's in the weeds here. Where are the details? Where are the costs? There's not a lot of that there. I mean, to your point, it's a little meatier in terms of big announcements, but the actual detail, what would the cost of that? Will it be a toll road? How are we going to roll some of these things out? I know they talked a lot about the subway expansion, et cetera. But in terms of costing and timing, which is really kind of critical as we move down the road on this stuff. I got a sense that we were looking at shiny things that were going to shift the narrative. And it certainly got us off, for example, talking about the vaccine mandate for healthcare workers.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty clear that, I guess, from a communication standpoint, that the highways was a big, feature that the government wanted to highlight. But you're right, there really are no details about it. And what we were told, reporters at a tech briefing from officials, is that, this is a competitive process, bidding process that they're going to have. They don't want to, say any cost. It would be inappropriate. Okay, sure, I'll go along with that. But the line from the minister was that they just really wanted to signal their intent to build these highways. And I think that, like, to John's point, that, yeah, it is about targeting spots. Like, that is playing a factor in this, because I think also it's going to put the NDP in a really tough position, because the minimum wage, for instance, some of these changes, this is all going to be in legislation that they have to vote on. And the bill has no chance of failing. I mean, or very little chance, because the PCs have a majority, but it's going to put the NDP in a tough position if they're going to vote against the minimum wage hike. They say $15 isn't enough now, and so do many experts. But if they vote against raising it, it's going to, like, the PCs are going to have a field day. They're going to keep saying the NDP says no, which we've already heard from them in some of their campaign style ads. The NDP will have a hard time living it down. And we already know or I guess just from what insiders have kind of been saying, is that some of the places the PCs are gunning for are NDP territory, like Windsor, the Southwest region down there, the North. Obviously, the 905 is always in play. So I think, highways sound good, but there's really not a lot of detail in how they're going to actually get built. So if we can get some details before the election, that would be great for people. But I think, they really just want to signal their intent that this is something they want to do at some point.
Well, let me just follow up on the minimum wage thing with you, Sabrina, because, as I hear the discussion and the debate and, the complaining about, well, it's too late, it's too little, my sense is for most of these businesses that are already having difficulty attracting employees, that in fact that minimum wage is already baked in, or they're paying more than the $15 an hour. So while it might sound terrific, and the Premier's throwing out some number like 700,000 workers or something that will benefit from this, my sense is that already it's too little, because companies or businesses or small businesses are already having to pay more than the $15 an hour. So to me, it was low-hanging fruit where it really isn't going to have an effect. And I hear the Independent Business Federation complaining about it, saying, we got kind of sideswiped by this. They had to have seen it coming, first of all. There's no way we're going to leave this in there. So that was one thing. But the other part of this is, and clarify for me, did I hear them say that they were going to be indexing this, the minimum wage moving forward?
Yeah, so it's going to be tied to inflation. So it'll be like, a little bit more than $15 every year after next year. And you're right. I think just market forces have kind of just, forced people to pay a little bit more. I think, people are making like 17 or 18 bucks an hour. That might be, typically minimum wage earners, that type of thing. I think the big deal is going to be for servers. And the flip side of that is that it's going to be another hit to restaurants. And so will be interesting to see how that plays out, because obviously we know restaurants are even having difficulty bringing staff back in. So this might be an incentive for that. But I think at the end of the day, people are generally okay with maybe like the cost of their entree going up a little bit, just to maybe cover this. And I think at the end, and just to maybe just conclude, is that it was maybe more about setting a base for the Ford government. Yeah. But I think you're right. Yeah. It is a bit low hanging fruit.
It was already indexed though. It was already indexed. And right, that's part of the problem, is that it went up by 10 cents in October 1st. And I think that's what forced the timing of the government. Why now? Because it went up by a dime October 1st, and that was just, almost an insult to the workers that he's been praising as frontline heroes, a lot of them on minimum wage. So I think that indeed pushed it up forward. So it already was indexed. They didn't do anything here other than raise that base rate up to 15, which was supposed to happen 3 years ago.
Keith, based on that and the worries we hear from small business saying we're going to have to absorb this, particularly when we have the servers going up to a standard minimum wage, that's a significant increase in terms of percentages. At the same time, they're not continuing with the support, the financial supports for these businesses that are still in huge debt. I mean, I talked to Rocco Rossi a couple of weekends ago, head of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, and, they're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt per some of these companies and some of these small businesses. So, yes, it's great to have the focus on the workers, but we still need the restaurant to be surviving if that restaurant worker is going to make that $15 an hour.
They're going to have somewhere to go, absolutely. And the Premier, when pressed on this, was basically said, we've already done so much for businesses, large and small, but he singled out small businesses, said they've reached out, they've done all this, and now it's time to take care of the workers. It was clearly a pivot to get those union leaders on side for that photo op, which is going to be a great PC ad. But in the end, it wasn't the right direction overall for the rest of them.
Yeah, and I sort of alluded to it earlier, John, but this whole idea of the healthcare vaccine mandate, I don't think that's going to go away in the short term. I think that's still going to create some heat. But my sense is that they're almost trying to rag the puck here until we get to the spring where, everybody will have had their double or, if you can get your third dose if required, that kind of thing, and things start to calm down. Even if we face a fifth wave, it's not going to be as much of an issue because we will have had businesses back and, kind of the economy bouncing back. If you can rag the puck until the spring, it's not such a big deal.
Well, for those of us who had double dosed of Astra, I guess I qualify within days for my third one, and I'm going to rag the puck a bit. Like, I mean, why get it right away when everything seems fine, when you can get it, maybe closer after Christmas, if, you know what I mean, if things are going to go in a different direction. I think you're absolutely right. They've taken the position that, with the timeline spaced out, that things are going to be far more open in the spring. And I think what that's done is give the incentive to those who are the anti-vaxxers to say, well, I'll just hold on. So it's not just ragging the puck for one thing, but it's allowing them to say, well, no, I'm not going to get it. Like, what's the point? Why don't I just wait?
Right.
And all that sort of stuff.
It's a leadership failure. Come on.
It is. And
no,
in Quebec, absolutely. So I'm on the side, I guess, personally, that I would rather have those people vaccinated. I don't care whether, they get some compensation for being off during a period of time. If you are going to rag the puck, you might as well allow them to do something rather than just be cut right off from society. But I think you're absolutely right. Whether it's Aaron O'Toole with what's going on in his caucus right now, or whether it's Quebec or Ontario, this is so far out of step with public opinion.
Stand your ground. New York stood its ground and the cops backed down. They backed down. The firefighters backed down. Almost all of them.
Yes, and in fact, almost all of the other agencies have. And I guess the one thing that the government can say is, well, it's up to the individual hospitals to do their own thing and all that sort of stuff. You know what? You don't have to pass the buck on this one. I mean, they should be very firm on it because it protects people's lives who are in vulnerable situations. Look, it's one of the things we talked about 3 or 4 episodes ago, and that is you can have all the political leadership you want on this issue, but there are consequences to it. And the question is, how do you manage the consequences if thousands of people are going to leave the healthcare system and you're not going to have them? That's what they're grappling with. But other jurisdictions have decided that, protecting the vulnerable.
Thousands aren't going to leave. Where's the proof? Where's the proof?
But if thousands are leaving, and again, the proof, and I think that came up, Sabrina, in post this discussion. Tell us where the 50,000 education workers are. Where are the healthcare workers? Who are they that aren't going to be the ones that will, get vaccinated? My own sense of the healthcare situation is that the vaccine situation is way down the list in terms of preventing somebody from continuing their job. It's their mental health. It's the stress on the job. It's all kinds of reasons why people are going to leave healthcare, and it's got nothing to do with vaccine requirements.
Yeah, and I think it was probably not the best look that we had the premier giving those numbers and then the health minister having to kind of walk them back just, shortly after that. I think people are just having a hard time reconciling. I guess maybe that the hypocrisy is kind of what the opposition critics are calling it here, is that, for certain jobs you need to have, or to go to see a basketball game, say, you need to have your vaccine mandate, but to take care of someone who's very ill, you don't need to be vaccinated. So I think, it's something that I don't think, it's going to go away anytime soon for the PCs. I think they might end up changing their mind. I don't know if that will happen, but I think right now it is kind of undermining the message and the push to go get vaccinated.
Well, changing your mind at this stage is worse than probably the position that they find themselves in right now. Listen, we're going to leave it there for this week on The Ledge. Sabrina Nanji, Keith Leslie, John Wright, thanks for being here. I'm Dave Trafford. It's the Ontario Politics Podcast. It's an Eye Contact production.